Now, it's been spun as the Donald Trump peace plan. In reality, it's an ultimatum. Donald Trump, of course, is saying this will come up with a new era of peace in the region. He obviously is hankering after the Nobel Peace Prize, which was quite notoriously given to Henry Kissinger after he flattened Southeast Asia. Now, what does this actually mean in practice? What are the details of this? Because now a lot of the onus is being placed on Hamas, that if they don't accept what has been laid out before them, which was not done in consultation with them, it is an ultimatum, then it will be on them the consequences. And Donald Trump has said that if there is an acceptance of this ultimatum in practice, then he will support Netanyahu to crush, quote unquote, Hamas in any way he deems fit, basically. We know what that means. It means genocidal slaughter. What are the details, though? I really want to be clear about what is being proposed here. And there's no better person to speak to than the always brilliant Palestinian analyst, Mohammed Shehada. Mohammed, great to speak to you as ever. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you again. Thanks for having me.
No, I just want to start now because you've been writing about this. So let's just start with, there are qualitative differences in terms of what's been proposed before, bearing in mind that earlier this year, Donald Trump himself publicly committed to removing the entire Palestinian population from Gaza and turning it into some sort of resort for billionaires, to treat as their playground. And that's not what's being proposed here.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So the reason why it's out now, it's because they realized it's undoable. They tried everything possible to implement it. Trump's people and Netanyahu's people have been talking to every single country on the face of earth to try to get Palestinians moved there. Indonesia, Libya, South Sudan, Somalia, European countries, Albania, Sarajevo, like Eastern European countries, Kosovo, etc. Whatever country or entity on the face of this earth there is, they tried it. It didn't work. Nobody wants to be complicit in genocide. So once they understood that it's unfeasible, they took that out and they're trying to package it now as a great act of mercy to Palestinians, that now they include in this plan very explicitly that Palestinians can stay in Gaza, and if those want to leave, they can leave with the right to return again. But that's about it. That's like one of the few good elements in there that are otherwise supposed to sugarcoat a dictate of capitulation. So what you have there, for example, another one is the US hinting towards canceling the murderous GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the front of the Israeli army that has been responsible for the killing of over 2,000 Palestinians waiting for food in line. They also hinted at the suspension of military operations and said that that would entail the suspension of bombing aerially or naval bombing. But that made no explicit mention of military operations on the ground that could be packaged as security measures. What you see in the West Bank, for example, the Israeli army raiding neighborhoods at 3 in the morning, 2 in the morning, in the dead of the night, breaking in, tossing everything upside down, kidnapping people at random, and then leaving again. There's no explicit sign that that would not be the case in Gaza as well. There's also something about that Hamas will not be asked to disarm or demilitarize. It says demilitarize in Gaza, but it spoke of a different word this time around, which is decommissioning. So that can mean a lot of things, but the closest example that comes to mind is Northern Ireland. You had disarmament as the outcome of a peace agreement, and it was a gradual process alongside a political process. So the IRA didn't have to hand over their weapons immediately and surrender. They put the weapons in a depot. And it took from 1998, when the agreement was signed, until 2007, almost 10 years, until those weapons were destroyed. And the weapons in that case acted as the guarantee, the insurance policy, that the agreement would be fulfilled to the end of it. So around, I think, 2001, you had the IRA saying that the British government is reneging on some of the promises and not fulfilling the agreement, and therefore we refuse to destroy the weapons. And then you needed civil society to step in and get the agreement back on track. So it could mean something similar. But with Israel, you have to always assume that they will take the worst, most bad faith interpretation of any agreement possible, or they will not fulfill any agreement in the first place. You had an Israeli prime minister called Ehud Barak, who once said about Gaza in particular, he said, sign a peace agreement or a ceasefire agreement, because once you sign, nobody cares about the details. You can do whatever you want, basically. And the last ceasefire agreement that we had signed with Netanyahu as soon as it was signed, he reneged virtually on almost every single pillar of it. The IDF was supposed to withdraw from Rafah, from the Philadelphia corridor. They never did. They were supposed to allow temporary housing in Gaza, caravans, and other forms of temporary shelter. They never did. They were supposed to allow trucks, bulldozers, etc., and they never did. So all of these elements, there's no guarantee that Israel would fulfill it in the first place. And then you have, of course, the huge number of loopholes, negatives, and explosive landmines that are implanted in there deliberately to ensure that even if Hamas signs this, it will not bring the Palestinians any good.
The Guardian diplomatic editor, Patrick Winter, I mean, he says, for example, I mean, he's himself talked about indefinite rule by Palestinian technocratic administration appointed, supervised and funded by a peace board chaired by Donald Trump and featuring Sir Tony Blair. Again, no clear benchmark for when this body falls and the Palestinian Authority will be deemed truly reformed and capable of running Gaza. So just a couple of things. I mean, that sounds like a Western colony. I mean, Palestinians have, for a very good reason, a long historical memory. And, within living memory, there was the British Mandate of Palestine. There were still Palestinians alive who lived under British rule. Tony Blair, of course, is the former British Prime Minister who is most known globally and, frankly, in Britain for the invasion of Iraq, which obviously was an illegal war which led to mass slaughter and carnage, not just in Iraq, beyond its borders as well. I mean, what's your sense then about the fact Tony Blair's been mooted, I guess, in this context?
Well, it has a lot of different entanglements an aspect with TikTok, and you have like a lot of different aspects going into it. But for better or worse, Blair, ironically, is one of the few Western politicians that made the effort of speaking to Hamas. And he said, I think around 2017, that it was a mistake to boycott Hamas when they won government. We should have tried to talk to them. We could have done business with them. On the other side, you have Blair, the one we know from Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., and the one that you know in Britain, what's the word, wanka. So I don't think he would be particularly charming to a lot of people hearing the name as the future governor of Gaza. If he's appointed as an advisor, he was previously appointed as the head of quartet. So Hamas was happy to deal with him, the Palestinian Authority as well, Israel as well. If he's appointed in a similar position, yes, good luck with that. But the problem is that this, what is called the Board of Peace, it's still undefined what kind of mandate it would have. But the clear glimpse we have from the Blair plan, which is heavily incorporated in Trump's proposal, is basically that this Board of Peace would be in charge of Gaza's diplomacy, Gaza's security policy, legislation, appointing and firing the leadership of the Gaza technocratic committee. So in other words, it is like a colonial government taking over the Democratic Republic of Congo and maintaining its presence there. It's something similar, for example, nowadays the closest example is the Danish control over Greenland. You have Greenland as an autonomous region, but then the Danish government sets the foreign policy and the security defense policy. So the Danish government has the right to veto, for example, an agreement that Greenland would try to sign with China because they would consider it a matter of national security. You would have the Board of Peace dictating what happens to Gaza's marine field, the Gaza gas field, a huge untapped potential that is enough to help with the reconstruction of Gaza. And if you have Blair and Trump putting their hand on it, it's like a caricature evil kind of situation. So that's one risk. The other risk is institutionalizing the intra-Palestinian division, that Gaza would become a completely separate entity from the West Bank, that Gaza is an entity of its own, which ties into this, the very weird item in the Trump plan about Gaza having this trade-free, tariff-free zone for whatever reason. Nobody in Gaza has ever heard of something of the sort, so I'm not sure what it's supposed to be there for. You have the other element about Gaza, that it would look more like Dubai or more like any of those Gulf capitals. And to be honest, no please, no thanks. Like Gaza had its spirit of originality. It does not need to become a concrete jungle. It doesn't need to be uglified in order for it to be prosperous. It had its own spirit and identity. We want it back to the way it looked before, minus the Israeli concentration camp that was imposed on it, the draconian siege. The other element is basically you have the return of the Palestinian Authority being explicitly conditioned on the PA capitulating 100% to Israel and losing whatever little legitimacy it still has with the Palestinian public. It basically, number one is the Palestinian Authority dropping the ICC case, the case at the International Criminal Court against Israel, Netanyahu in particular, against Israeli settlements, against the Israeli genocide in Gaza. That case should be completely out of the door. The other thing is that the Palestinian Authority should never join any international organization without Israel's permit. Israel dictates what the Palestinian Authority would do. So you also impose a similar mandate rule on the West Bank under the Israeli government that would take the very little self-rule that is given to Palestinians. So in the West Bank right now, the Palestinian Authority has it's an authority by name only. It can only protect Israel from Palestinians. It cannot protect Palestinians from Israeli settlers. An Israeli settler can walk today into Ramallah, shoot people in the street at point blank, and the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to arrest them, interrogate them, imprison them whatsoever. They're only allowed to return them to the Israeli police or the Israeli military to do absolutely nothing to them whatsoever. So you're taking away the symbolic authority of that PA, the ability to join international organizations, the ability to raise the Palestinian flag on top of the UN or in the reception area of the UN. You're taking all of these away. So what kind of authority remains after this? There's nothing. You're basically laying it bare to the bone of what it is, a puppet government that is there to maintain a cost-free occupation for Israel.
I mean, and the fact it's all open-ended as well. I mean, this is the point here in terms of, they say reformed, as you know, they talk about a reformed Palestinian Authority, when in practice, it's interesting. Obviously, the Israeli regime demonize the Palestinian Authority as this radical hotbed of extremism and terrorism, and actually practice the Palestinian Authority serves as a kind of de facto adjunct to the Israeli occupation in lots of ways in the West Bank. It doesn't in any way obviously challenge the Israeli occupation, but it says a reformed Palestinian Authority, and that includes, for example, dropping, as you know, accountability for Israeli war crimes, dropping the cases in the International Criminal Court, or support for the cases by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. But it's like Israel will just end up saying it's not being reformed. It's not being reformed. It will never be good enough. So, all of these are kind of, when this happens, then this will be allowed. But in practice, they will just end up saying this hasn't happened, and therefore we won't facilitate this stage.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So two things. Number one, with the Palestinian Authority, it's been always the strongest element lending the most credence to Hamas has been the humiliation, weakening, defunding, and demonization of the Palestinian Authority, no matter how much it tries to please Israel or the Western community or the US or Europe. So you have the Palestinian Authority, as I said earlier, collaborating with Israel, providing intelligence against Palestinians, arresting Palestinians on the street, doing everything possible to protect Israel's occupation, Israeli settlers, and then getting bombardment with accusations that it is a sponsor of terrorism, although it's day and night collaborating with Israeli security agencies against Palestinians. So that humiliation has been the strongest credence to Hamas, that would come to us and say, look, why do you ask us to recognize Israel and renounce violence when Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority President, Mahmoud Abbas, did all of these things word for word and more? He said, I live under the boots of the Israeli occupation. He said, I never want to go back to my home village, Safad, the one that he was forced out of at the age of, I think, 12 at the time, on a literal death march. The Israelis came into his village and he was a teenager. They kicked him out. He had to go on a death march out of it. And he says, I never want to go back there. And he said the security collaboration with Israel is sacred. It's a religious thing for him. And despite all of these things, you have him humiliated day and night. He cannot leave the West Bank. He cannot even leave his home and cross from one Palestinian city to another without a permit from a junior Israeli officer in the military. So Hamas would always point the finger and say, look, he's humiliated despite of all of this. You want us to do the same and get the same kind of humiliation? What good would come out of it? Which is why with recognition, I kept telling European governments that recognition at least would give some safe face to the Palestinian moderate camp, some symbolic victory that they can show to their people and say, look, diplomatic engagement, moderation, sucking up to Israel, the West paid off in one way or another. Now, the other thing about the moving goalpost, the never-ending moving of the goalpost, it's a classic Israeli trick. It's exactly how we ended up with the security coordination in the first place. Under the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians were forced to police Israel's occupation for free. to protect Israel against Palestinians and not protect Palestinians against Israelis. The logic of it is that we were supposed to prove to Israel that if we get our own state on 22% of our historic homeland, we can guarantee that they would not face any risks or threats from our future country. So that was supposed to be one end of the bargain, is guarantee us, show us that you can maintain our security. And then every year you had Israeli officials saying, yeah, the Palestinian security forces are doing a good job, they're improving, but it's not enough. We still need them to demonstrate more ability to suppress any kind of threat towards Israel. The threat is undefined, so they can claim anything at all to be a threat, and they can keep moving the goalpost. It's the same when Israel was about to leave Gaza in 2005. What was called the unilateral disengagement. They never left. First of all, they moved a few settlers to the West Bank and moved tenfold the amount of settlers to the West Bank after, and they redeployed the military outside the Gaza concentration camp to guard it from land, air, and sea. Gaza's airspace, water space were shut down ever since. But when they disengaged in that way, when they redeployed, you had the Israeli Prime Minister's advisor, he was called Dov Westglass, explicitly saying, we are leaving, we are withdrawing in order to prevent a Palestinian state, in order to freeze the peace process, in order to kill any chance of Palestinian statehood. And he said it explicitly. He said, when we leave, we throw the burden of proof on Palestinians to show us that they can maintain our security airtight 100%, otherwise they'll never have a state. And he knew that when you leave Gaza, while cutting Gaza's entire labor force from the Israeli and the Palestinian market, you had about almost 100,000 Palestinian workers that lost their jobs overnight. So unemployment went up to 50% of the population. Half of Gaza were unemployed overnight. The economy experienced what Sarah Roy, the Harvard economist, called the worst economic depression in modern history. So you had all of these parameters. Israel knew that this means chaos. It doesn't mean Gazans will become Canadians or Swiss. So they gave us that impossible test so that we would fail at it, and then they would blame us for it and maintain the occupation and increase it. And it's the same kind of stunt. In Gaza, what you have is basically Netanyahu saying, I will leave when you assure me that Gaza would pose zero threat or even zero prospect of a resurgent threat. Not just that the threat is over, but there's no possibility that the threat can emerge in the future. What that means is that the IDF will stay in Gaza forever. As simple as that. Even with the staged withdrawal, the first stage would give Israel over 50% of Gaza's area. The second stage would give Israel about 40% of Gaza's area. It gives Israel all of the agricultural land in Gaza. Gaza's entire food basket would be in Israel's control, inaccessible to us, declared as a military zone, which means increasing, escalating, sustaining the famine that you see in Gaza at the moment, the dependence on international aid. And you wouldn't have the patience of the international community running long enough to keep feeding Gazans for the next decade. At some point, donors will say, we've been paying them long enough. Why should we keep sending billions and billions in wheat, flour, and rice and food that is bought from Israel, that pours money into the Israeli economy to feed starving Gazans? So what you end up with is a new recipe for an inherently destabilizing situation in Gaza that Israel can then blame on us and say, look, Gaza is a hotbed of chaos, therefore we're staying there, we're not leaving.
Just linked to that point about the deliberate starvation of the Palestinian people by Gaza, by the Israeli state in Gaza, which forms the core of the arrest warrants issued against Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister Yoav Gallant by the International Criminal Court. In the so-called comprehensive plan, it says, upon acceptance of this agreement, full aid will be immediately sent into the Gaza Strip. And that is an admission, is it not? It's an admission that despite the claims of Israel, who say unimpeded aid is being allowed into Gaza, that's actually not happening. And another point, just before I ask you about what happens next, Greg Karlstrom at the Middle East correspondent of The Economist says that the list of ingredients is a recipe. As an example, it envisages a stabilization force to provide security in Gaza, but someone involved in talks confirmed to me today that no country has actually volunteered to send troops. So it's not actually, it is an ultimatum, not a peace plan, but it's just kind of aspirations thrown in with no, that's just an example of there's nothing concrete there.
Yep. Yeah, there's three things to unpack here. Number one, the ultimatum. It is deliberately an ultimatum sent there for Palestinians to reject and then blame them for what comes next, whether it's mass ethnic cleansing in Gaza or the annihilation of Gaza City. This morning, the Israeli newspaper Wala, they said that Israel destroyed, obliterated in Gaza City alone over 1,200 high-rise buildings and multi-story homes since the beginning of Gideon's Chariot number 2. So in September alone, Israel did about 1,200 9/11s to Gaza. That's number one. And you had Trump explicitly saying at the press conference that if Hamas says no to this, Netanyahu will give a free hand to crush them. He can do whatever he wants. So that's exactly what the deal is for. Number two, in terms of aid, the promise that more aid will go in is worthless, because the last time we had a ceasefire agreement signed, it had all these stipulations about how much aid should go into Gaza, how many trucks per day. It said 500, 600 trucks per day. It said that there would be caravans, bulldozers, excavation equipment. None of it was allowed in. The number of trucks, it went up and down, it fluctuated. At some point, Hamas said that we will suspend releasing more Israeli captives until Israel recommits to this. And then Israel never recommitted. They said, okay, let's resume it and see what happens. And it kept fluctuating up and down like the stock exchange, almost like Bitcoin. And the other thing that you mentioned is that it proves Israel is deliberately starving Gaza. So when the Israeli government comes out and tells the people on the Gaza flotilla, the Samud flotilla, Greta Thunberg and her amazing colleagues, that give us the food and we will give it to Gaza, well, here's an easier solution. Allow the thousands of trucks that are standing on the Egyptian side of the border, allow them into Gaza. There's enough food there to feed every single person in Gaza for 3 months minimum. That is only the food that is currently waiting in line for UNRWA alone. There are many other UN agencies, many other international organizations. Allow this in, the flotilla would become redundant. But if you're blocking thousands of trucks from going in, why would you allow the food that is coming through the flotilla in and not the thousands of trucks? There's the other thing, the element about the international stabilizing force. It depends what is the scope, the mandate of this. And that would decide whether countries will participate in it and whether it would succeed. So, for example, in terms of countries participating, I've spoken to a number of Gulf governments, European governments, and they said the only way we will participate in this is if the Palestinians themselves invite us to come in. The Palestinian Authority officially needs to invite us, and the Palestinians in general need to have a buy-in into our presence. We're not going to send people on a suicide mission to do Israel's dirty work to continue the genocide, the policing, the counterinsurgency. You had this endless concept of counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, which was a catch-22. Every time the American or the Iraqi or the Afghan or the collaborating troops or the British troops would go into villages, police it, shoot people, kill people, they created more militants that would try to fight them back to drive them out of the country or collapse the collaborating governments in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you have a similar concept. Without a popular buy-in from the population, they're not going to go there. That's why there was earlier insistence on calling it a protection mission and deploying it in the West Bank as well, not just in Gaza. So that's protecting Palestinians from Israel explicitly, and then buffering between Israel and Gaza, or fulfilling Israel's security demands or whatever. The third condition, many of these countries have said, we will only send troops to Gaza if you establish a clear pathway towards Palestinian statehood. We're not gonna be stuck in the same trap that the Palestinian Authority is stuck into, policing the occupation endlessly for free, rendering the occupation cost-free for Israel to expand it, entrench it more, displace Palestinians more and more and more and more endlessly, without any time frame, without any standards, clear pathway towards ending this apartheid system. So these three demands, I don't think that Israel would fulfill any of them. Israel doesn't want the Palestinian Authority to have anything to do in Gaza. There was celebration in Israeli newspapers this morning that this agreement will further weaken and humiliate the Palestinian Authority. And they don't want a popular buy-in, because the mission of the international troops would be counterinsurgency, to suppress the population, to do what the IDF failed to do, which is go after Hamas, dismantle them, look for the tunnels, look for the militants, look for the weapons. And Israel failed to do this over 23 months of unprecedented warfare in the 21st century. So you think a soldier from Canada, without any experience about the Middle East, without any knowledge of it, would have what it takes to go against Hamas and succeed? Not a chance.
I mean, just in terms of what happens next, then. I mean, Netanyahu himself has boasted. I mean, he's, as you say, he's boasting about this big humiliation that he's managed to, kind of bring the Arab world on Israel's side, and I kind of nod to the idea that Israel's been made a pariah, and that actually the reverse is the case. And also, he has said that the IDF will remain occupying most of Gaza. What do you think will happen? Do you think this is intended because it'll be a few days, it's predicted, until Hamas come up with their response? Is the prediction, or your prediction, you think that Hamas will come back in a few days with some amendments? They won't, say we're rejecting this is a disgrace. They'll come back with some amendments, and then that will be styled by Netanyahu as a rejection of the deal, with Trump's backing, and then that will mean a resumption of the genocidal war of annihilation, but actually maybe taken to the most extreme level. Yeah, I mean, what's your kind of sense of where this is heading?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you have is Trump muscled Arab countries, Turkey as well, Pakistan, any government at all that he met with at the UN General Assembly, into supporting his proposal to Gaza. You saw all of these countries welcoming it. They did not particularly comment on the substance of it, but they welcomed the idea that there is a new proposal, because you can obviously see that they are being forced to do this to show some sort of international consensus. But then you saw the government of Turkey and Qatar immediately convening in Doha to advise the Hamas delegation on what they should do next, what their response should be like. And for Hamas, they understand there is a clear item in the proposal that says if Hamas refuses this deal, we will move forward with it nonetheless. Even if Hamas is not on board, we're going to move with it. And it explicitly says we're going to move in what it calls the terror-free areas. The terror-free areas in Gaza are the areas that are controlled by the Israeli-run proxy gangs. So you have the Abu Shabab, the ISIS-linked gang in Rafah on the borders with Egypt. That is the largest of them. That is the one that's created, funded, equipped, sheltered, and operated by the IDF and the Shin Bet, the Israeli security forces. They're the ones that brought them together, created for them this location to be at, and they tried to push the entire Palestinian population into that area on the borders with Egypt. And the plan says that this area, the Abu Shabab criminal gang, the ISIS-linked criminal gang, would receive international backing and legitimacy, that you would have the international stabilizing mission going into those areas and starting from them. There's another area that was created in Khan Yunis, in the very areas. So the IDF would go into a town. They would kick everybody out. They would annihilate everything. They would declare it what is called an extermination zone, meaning anyone walking in there unauthorized will be shot immediately upon sight, or kidnapped and taken hostage, never to be heard from again. And then they would bring these criminal elements into that depopulated extermination zone and put them in charge of it. And then they would try to push people into that area. So they created a similar one in Khan Yunis under a guy called, I think, Hussam al-Astal. They created another one in Gaza City, in the very east of it, under another guy called Rami Hillis, another one called, I think, something Jindi, Ahmed Jindi, or something like that. They tried to create a similar one in Beit Hanun and Beit Lahia, the very, very north of Gaza. Each of those areas are very tiny. What you have in the plan is basically trying to get Hamas to say no, so you get international legitimacy for the most dangerous aspect of Israel's genocide, pushing the population into areas operated by criminal gangs, by literal terrorists, by literal ISIS members, and then facilitating their expulsion out of Gaza. Because once you corner them in Rafah on the borders with Egypt, in an area called El Shoka, in an area that they would never be allowed to go back to Gaza again, they're just stuck in this concentration camp in miserable conditions. All it would take is tighten the screws a bit, and people will run towards Egypt out of their own accord, and Israel will just say, we have nothing to do with this. It's people running on their own. See, it's not us that is ethnically cleansing Gaza. And that is the most dangerous aspect of this proposal, and the most dangerous final phase of the genocide that we're currently seeing unfolding. The reason why Israel went into Gaza City in particular, it's the largest urban space left in there. It has about 1 million people left in it. They wanted to kick all of them south, because the south is already overcrowded, so that more and more people escape the overcrowding into the Abu Shabab concentration camp on the Egyptian borders. So what I think Hamas will do, they will not say no to the agreement. They will say, we welcome it. It's a good stepping stone. It's a good starting point. But here are our reservations and concerns. Netanyahu, of course, as you said earlier, Owen, he will just say, look, the reservations mean Hamas rejected the entire deal. But you have to keep in mind, The Trump declaration, the Trump proposal that was unveiled today is dramatically different from the one that he articulated a couple of days ago. I got a copy of the earlier one. There's a lot of stuff that's been removed. There's a lot of stuff that's been added last minute. For example, it had an element about the de-radicalization of both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, which is an unprecedented acknowledgement of the extremism, the widespread extremism that we see in Israel on social media. Most of the atrocities in Gaza are documented by Israeli soldiers that then post it to brag about it and delight in the pain and suffering and murder of Gazans. And you have this clear acknowledgement that in Israel you have extremism going out of control, that it needed de-radicalization. Now it was softened to something that says changing the mindset and narrative in Israel and amongst the Palestinians towards peace. The last element is basically in the plan, it says something about a horizon towards peaceful coexistence. And this is the most dangerous in terms of long-term thinking, because Trump even qualified it further in the press conference. He said, Netanyahu, I know he opposes Palestinian statehood completely. He rejects the two-state solution. He rejects Palestinian statehood. What coexistence means is the vision of the worst of Israeli settlers, the far right in Hebron, what is called the autonomous areas. Basically, the West Bank, it has an area called Area A that is 16% of the West Bank's area, or even less. So in total of the entire Palestinian historic Palestine, it would be less than about 2 or 3% of historic Palestine's area. And those 16% are disconnected enclaves or cages. And Israel's vision is that each one of those enclaves would rule itself in an autonomous area under Israeli control. So it's something like an autonomous zone in Russia. There's something called the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in Russia, which, unknown to a lot of people, is the second Jewish jurisdiction around the world after Israel. Yiddish there is an official language. It was designated for Jewish people. It has about only less than 2% of Israel's population. It has about, I think, 100,000 people living in it.
It was founded by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s.
Exactly. And it's twice Israel's size. So every time Israelis say we have no other place, that's why Gazans and Palestinians should leave. Now you have another place right there. It's still waiting there. If you want to talk about kicking people out, do you want to really go down that road? Because like Israelis keep saying that, we feel unsafe, uncomfortable, unloved in the Middle East. We're constantly threatened. We're surrounded by enemies. That area is waiting for you. Putin is a very good friend of Netanyahu. China has a lot of business interest with Israel. They were supposed to, I think they do actually run the port of Haifa. I'm not sure, but they were supposed to hold a monopoly over Israeli seaports. So, yep, you can easily imagine Israelis moving in there. If you want to talk about ethnic cleansing, nobody should entertain that idea in the first place. But my point is, it would become something like this, an autonomous area within a country that is ruled by that country. And that is the vision that Israel has for Palestinians. That's what it calls peaceful coexistence. They always talk about upward mobility. I once met a Trump senior official last year in December, and his face turned red as soon as he heard the word rights, Palestinian rights. He only wanted to talk about economic opportunities, business opportunities, upward mobility, because none of it entailed any rights whatsoever. It just means give Palestinians the jobs that no Israeli wants to do. In Trump's earlier plan, what was called Peace to Prosperity, there was an economic chapter to it, and it talked about redeveloping, reimagining the Palestinian economy. And then you had a major panic attack in Israel, a meltdown, even though Trump's first plan was garbage. It gave Palestinians like way less than the minimum under international law. And it gave Israel full control over whatever entity would have been created out of this plan. But even the mere mention of developing the Palestinian economy, it got Netanyahu immediately saying, do you think I will let Palestinians have high-tech industries or chip industries? No way. And that's exactly what you have here. Upward mobility just means indentured labor in Israel, Palestinians just working in Israeli farms, agriculture, etc., maintaining a sort of a primitive economy. So if you want to convince Hamas to disarm, they already made the declaration. They're willing to disarm if there's a clear path towards Palestinian statehood. But coexistence in this fluffy kumbaya terms, it's very hard pill to swallow.
Grim stuff, very dystopian, I have to say. I mean, it is a very dystopian ultimatum which has been issued, and I understand people's desperation for this genocide to end, but we need to listen to what Palestinian voices are telling us very clearly and very explicitly. And the fact that Netanyahu has, with all we know about him, all he's done, all of his past statements, the fact he's so enthusiastically swung behind this so-called peace deal, in practice ultimatum, should be instructive, because it's just another stage in Israel's very open, the most confessed and documented genocide as it happened in human history. It's always such an honor, obviously, to have you, Mohammed. I mean, for those watching, please share the video, press like, subscribe, and leave your comments. But honestly, it's always a pleasure. We'll be following this obviously very carefully in the coming days, and I'll certainly be sharing Mohammed's analysis everywhere, all over social media. Make sure you're following him as well, because he's absolutely crucial to follow all the way through this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to see you, Owen.
You too.
Have
Always.
a good day.
You too.